Halvor Tjønn, welcome. You are historian, author, journalist, and an expert pertaining to Norwegian history and Viking history. And it's quite exciting to look back in time at the period where the Viking Age brought such expansion and technological wonders, actually, and made the Viking era such a time in Scandinavian history where we were fearless men and fearless women. Why did the Viking Age and what caused the Viking Age to expand to such a large degree?
It's quite clear that the Viking Age was quite a unique epoch in the history of the Northern Europe, or in Europe altogether. And the basis for the technological basis for the Viking Age was, of course, the design of the Viking ship. And it was, of course, also, you can ask, why did the Scandinavians design the Viking ship? Why did not the French or the Italians or anyone else do it? And we must explain that to the fact that Scandinavia was part of Europe with small kingdoms, with a huge increase in the population, and with different groups seeking to develop their influence and power in Scandinavia, but also in Europe. And those people in Scandinavia developed an expertise in shipbuilding. And it's not one single invention that made the Viking ships, but it is a number of different improvements of existing ships. For instance, the Anglo-Saxons had gone to Britain several hundred years before the Viking Age. So ships had existed in the northern European area for hundreds of years. But the Vikings developed a certain kind of ship that made them superior to all other groups in the European area. And not at least the fact that Viking ships could cross the high oceans, and they could go inland to land, and they could land their men on land, and they could make these raids on a very rapid scale. And this made the Vikings, or the Northern Europeans, or the Scandinavians, this made them militarily superior. And with this superiority was, of course, also they had a huge economic advantage because they made Viking warrior ships and also ships for trade, which also were quite advanced for that time.
It was quite a spectacular period in history, and when looking back at personalities and military leaders, excellent leaders, such as Harald Hardrade, who actually requested to come with his half-brother Olav Haraldsson, or Saint Olaf, to come to Stiklestad, where his half-brother was killed in 1030. And after that, Hardrade had to flee. And where did he flee? He fled to Russia. There seems to be such a great connection in history between the Russian people of Kiev and with the Scandinavians.
Yes, that's obvious. If you read sagas written down at Iceland in the 13th century, most of them, you see this very close connection between Scandinavia and what was called Kiev Rus at that time in the Viking times, and also later in the medieval epoch. And that is, of course, based on the fact that the Russian state, which you can clearly see from the sources, from the historic sources written down in Kiev, and also from the Scandinavian sources, that the Russian state was more or less founded by Scandinavian warriors who came to the Russian rivers. They found the trade routes from the Gulf of Finland and down to the Black Sea and even to the Caspian Sea. The reason why they wanted to find these trade routes was, of course, the need to get silver. Silver was the currency of that time, and Scandinavia did not have any silver. So the Vikings who wanted to found kingdoms and who wanted to strengthen their military and political power, they needed silver. And silver was to be found in Byzantium and in the Arab Caliphate in Baghdad. And to get there, they had to cross the huge, enormous Russian land. And they found these routes through the 8th and 9th century. And on the way down to Byzantium and to the Caspian Sea, they founded the Russian state. This is quite clear from the historic sources, and all the historic sources bear witness on that. There are no sources bearing witness about the opposite.
It's interesting to study that period of time as well, because we quickly notice that the Vikings never went Viking to the east. They always went Viking towards the west and plundered and raped and all this we've heard of. But when they had crisis at home in Norway and in Scandinavia, where did they flee? They fled to Russia, to their brothers there.
Yeah, of course, because the Russian state was founded by Scandinavians, and also later in history, the rulers in Novgorod and Kiev had the center of their armies was made up by Scandinavians. And you have several passages in the sagas telling about the different rulers in Kiev and Novgorod when they had troubles and they needed to strengthen their military power. They went to Scandinavia and they got warriors from Scandinavia to make up the nucleus of their armies. And it's quite obvious, I think, the sagas don't tell about this in detail, but it's quite obvious that far into the medieval epoch, in Novgorod, in Kiev, and in the other Russian cities, there must have been a rather important segment of the population speaking Scandinavian languages. So when the Scandinavian kings who had to flee Norway, for instance, came to Novgorod and Kiev, they could speak their mother tongue. It was no problem to communicate with the rulers in Novgorod and Kiev at that time.
And it's very exciting as well to look even further south to what today is Turkey. At the time, the Emperor of Constantinople, it was a Christian land, and the Emperor chose of all the people to have for his personal guard, the Varangian Guard, he chose the rough, fearless Vikings who were more brutal and more tough in battle than anyone else. I think he had several thousand of them, and Harald Hardrade served under him as well as so many others at that time, and went and helped him, I mean, in the lands of Israel, what is today Israel, Jordan, all the way into Iraq. It's quite remarkable. We do have an ancestry of having quite a number of mercenaries among us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very fascinating stories in the Icelandic sagas about warriors from Iceland coming home to Iceland after they had served in the guard of the emperor in Byzantium. And the sagas tell about how they were dressed with their beautiful clothes the emperor of Byzantium had given to them, the fantastic, beautiful swords, etc., etc. And this is told, for instance, in the Icelandic sagas. But we have a huge story in the Heimskringla, in the Snorri saga, about Harald Sigurdsson, when he served as a colonel in the life guard of the emperor, and how he fought in Sicily. They say he went to the Holy Land and also he went to Bulgaria to serve the interest of the emperor, and he became a rich man in that process. And based on all the riches he made in the service of the emperor in Byzantium, he married the daughter of the king of, or the prince of Kiev. And this princess of Kiev, Elisaveta, she became the Norwegian queen for 20 years, from 1046 to 1066. And this was a very important formative period for the Norwegian state, because Harald Hårde, he built the strong Norwegian state in the medieval epoch, but with this Russian princess at his side.
And another element that is not that often spoken of is actually the fact that the Vikings and the early Scandinavians had the things, and the whole idea of democracy in Europe actually comes and stems from that time period in its early foundations.
Yeah, there are of course several sources for what we can call modern democracy, but it's quite obvious that one of the most important sources of modern democracy was the thinking in the old Germanic societies that the power was based on the people. The people at the thing, at the, well, we can call it the kind of parliament, was the one who gave the laws, and the laws were superior to everyone. The king had to abide to the law. If the king if the king broke the law, the people had not only the possibility, but the people had the duty to kill the king. So there was no royal tyranny like you had, for instance, in China, in India, you had in the Muslim world. There was a superiority of the law. And when people is ruled by the law, and you have the notion, the very fundamental way of thinking that the power emerges from the people, this is of course one of the basic foundations of modern democracy. I don't think modern democracy could have developed without this very important way of thinking in Northern Europe. And then of course it's no coincidence that democracy, modern democracy, emerged in Northern Europe. Modern democracy did not emerge in China. It did definitely not emerge in the Muslim world, and not in India. It emerged in those countries who had this medieval thinking about the superiority of the law, and this notion that the king was not superior to the law, but had to abide to the law. So this is, I think, extremely important to think when we think about what caused the emergence of democracy, to think about the Northern European way of constructing the society.
And an interesting detail as well being the fact that the kingdoms of Normandy, the Normandy then colonized by, of course, Rollo and his descendants, who were Scandinavians and Vikings at that time. And then eventually the famous year of 1066, where William the Conqueror comes and conquers England, and only 2 weeks earlier, one of his cousins, Harald Hardrade, had the battle at Stamford Bridge. 2 weeks later, he comes from the south. Who knows whether that wasn't coincidence, because they were in kin. And after that, we see the democracy, the idea and the things then permeating into the whole of Europe, and even the kings and queens of Europe to this day actually then do have something that stems from the Vikings as well.
Yes, of course the year 1066 is a decisive year in not only in English history, but in the history of the world, because development of England and of the British world has of course been decisive for development of the whole world, for the United States, for Northern Europe, and for the whole British Empire, which does not exist today, but of course the traces of the British Empire exists, and the way the British thought is so important for us today. And you see, a very important thing with the Vikings was that they had this notion of a kind of democracy, but at the same time they were very well organized. Democracy did not go together with anarchy, it went together with organization. And that made the Viking realms and the different Viking groups so strong that they were not slaves, they were free men. They fought together, and no one, they did not have any tyrants to rule them. And at the same time, they were extremely well organized. So this combination of freedom and organization went together, and that really made the Vikings and the different Viking kingdoms in Europe superior to very many other kingdoms in Europe.
An interesting fact that illustrates the connection between Russia and Scandinavia and Turkey, for that matter, is the fact that the patron saint Nicholas, the patron saint of the seafarers at the time of Harald Hardrada and later, when the Vikings were the Varangian Guard, as Muslims then came, and eventually Turkey went from being a Christian lands to Muslim lands, and even earlier, very many of these returned to the northern lands, both to Russia and Scandinavia, and they brought with them a patron saint, and that was Saint Nicholas. And this is the reason why today we say Santa Claus comes from the north, from Russia and from Scandinavia. Actually, he was a saint who was very rich and gave gifts to children and poor women in Turkey and the Mediterranean area. So it's strange to see how Russia then has St. Nicholas churches all over Russia, and we do in Scandinavia as well, as a testimony of the brotherhood actually and of the international expansion between these peoples at that time.
Yeah, this shows the cultural mix that came as a result of course, the existence of Eastern Roman Empire, the expansion of Christianity into Russia from Constantinople, and also, of course, this very important expansion of the Vikings into the Russian lands. And it shows also that the cultural connections were so close in those days. So the Vikings brought military power to Russia and Byzantium, but they took back to Scandinavia the ideas about Christianity and also the ideas about how to build organized states. Which is, of course, very obvious that Harald, the Norwegian king up till 1066, between 46 and 66, that a lot of his statesmanship was learned in the eastern lands. And he was actually maybe the most important king in medieval Norway, the man who founded the strong consistent Norwegian state in the medieval time, and he had his learning years in Russia and in Constantinople. So this is, of course, a very important cultural, political, military, and religious connection between Byzantium, Russia, and the Scandinavian area.